secondary fuel use is another problem. So when we are talking about the solving the problems, we need to empower the women. We need to involve the, like when we are talking about the Prime Minister Ujjwala Yojana or other intervention, we need to give more weightage and more power to the women decision as a decision maker. We need to develop some kind of campaign so that there would be an increase in the use of LPG. That's the problem, and there would be increase in the use of only LPG as a fuel, not biomass as a secondary fuel. This is a graph which shows that out of the total Prime Minister Ujjwala Yojana users, 81% in the Bihar, 83% in Jharkhand, in states of India, and other states. You can see the majority of them are using the biomass as a secondary fuel. And when the age of this connection increases, there is a decrease in the biomass polluting fuel users. So when it comes to the solution of the indoor air pollution, I think we need to understand that it's remaining 19% of the household in Ujjwala Yojana who are only using LPG as a cooking fuel. What are the variables? What are the factors they are motivating them to only use the LPG factors? So from there, those 19% of the household, we can understand the ground reality and we can work accordingly. That's one thing. Also, then other variables like women in the decision making that we need to understand. So another aspect is about like ventilation system. And in India, I think because in the most of the Indian household, especially the poor household, the ventilation system is very poor. So that is also one of the major reason of the indoor air pollution, because the rural area we do not have much of the outdoor air pollution, but because and it's not coming into the household, but because of the poor ventilation, they are more exposed to the indoor air pollution. So I just mapped I think these are the urban areas of the different parts of the India. The ventilation system in the poor ventilation system in the different households of the different cities of the India. You can see that I think you see the big dots where 80 to 100% of the household are having poor ventilation system. This is the important thing. So when we are talking about the buildings and other things, these things which need to be considered. Like this is another important aspect that we need to think about when it comes to the indoor air pollution. And then finally, in this slide, I would like to because this is another study of that 480 cities. So where what I did, I just estimated the avoided premature mortalities because of the different interventions. So this is the baseline premature mortalities because of the indoor air pollution in these more than 400 cities. So if we can only improve the ventilation system, we can avoid about 3% of the premature mortalities. If we can simply shift from the biomass, the dung cake to the firewood, we can shift, I think, about 3 to 4% of the premature mortalities. And just making aware the people or LPG users to not to use biomass as a polluting fuel as a secondary fuel, only targeting the LPG users, not targeting the polluting fuel users, only targeting the LPG users and making them aware that you already have LPG in your household. Please use that LPG only. That would reduce about 30%, 35% of the premature mortality. That is a huge number. So with this slide, I would stop. Thank you so much.
I want to say a very big thank you to Dr. Ajay. That was quite detailing. Thank you so much for the presentation. You have talked basically on the need to sensitize, because I'm going to bring everything together as in advocacy, because most people do these things without even know why they're doing it, and then the health implications. You have dealt with the fact of the matter, talking about the death rates from air pollution and ventilation, poor ventilation being a major factor, because people lock themselves in Lagos, Nigeria. We recorded deaths from people using a generator within the household, within the house, because they don't want it stolen. So these are things that are avoidable, but because of the lack of awareness,
Sorry, we cannot hear you.
Hello?
Yeah, we might
Yes.
have lost BC there temporarily, so go ahead, BC.
Can you hear me? Okay, yes, please. We talked about accessibility and affordability of the cooking gas. So we need to come up with a policy framework in this direction because most people want to make the change, but to transform, we need the process has to be in place. Awareness. I'm doing it not because I want to, but because of the health benefits attached to the change. So that was quite detailing for us in this session. Talking about the income, the low income population, they are mostly at risk because of the source of income is very mega and they don't even have the ability to do most of these things. So we are looking at how can we encourage people to transform, to change. Back here in Nigeria, a lot of free donations, as in cooking gas donation to the rural women, had been on for some time. But how do we sustain it? Sustainability is the thing. Whatever we have said here, it's how to put them together to ensure that they all come to play. And then we talked about tax incentives. For people who are compliant, how do we encourage them? If you decide to bring in gas a lot to support people to go, policies of government, there should be some compensation. So let's look at how we can bring all of that together in our at the end of the day in the policy framework towards achieving the goal. So I would like to take questions if there's any now.
So I have, there's one in the chat from, let me just make sure that I'm reading from Dr. Russell Jones. He asked, why is the estimate for India only 1 million premature deaths annually? If you accept the paper by Burnett et al. In PNAS of 8.8 million globally, then India shares at least 1.5 million. The true figure is doubtless higher.
Okay. You want to respond to that?
So yeah, the premature mortality is as estimated by the Global Burden Disease. It's for the outdoor air pollution is about 0.9 million, and for the indoor air pollution is 0.7 million. So that is 1.5 million total.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
So I have a question of my own, BC.
Okay. All right, David.
Sorry, and it's one that the previous panel touched on to an extent, but I wanted to hear the views of the speakers on this panel. The WHO argues that the disproportionate way in which indoor air pollution affects women and children makes indoor air pollution a gender issue. And I just wanted to understand what, from the speakers, what they feel are appropriate solutions that countries and cities and urban areas, communities need to consider in addressing that, but from a gender perspective, but also from the perspective of ensuring that they redress any of the inequalities that lead to that being the case, that to those groups of people being disproportionately affected. So.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Karen, you want to take that?
Well, just thank you for the opportunity. Yes, well, I think that definitely it is gender related, and I think that something that highlights this is that we have more or less 1 billion people without access to electricity, but more than 3 billion without access to clean energy. And I think that this disproportion, that we have a lot more access to electricity than to clean energy, it may be related that the kitchen is woman's territory, and sometimes others don't see the point of improving or giving access to energy for the woman, for the kitchens, for clean cooking. Then I think that definitely has a lot to do with gender. And I think that's something that you were talking before about this issue of how to make it possible, how to really make affordable the different fuels, the clean fuels. I think that affordability is one of the biggest concerns. And I have seen in other regions, like for example in the Americas, that they have done this through subsidies to LPG, for example, to electricity. And when you have a high subsidy, a really very high subsidy, you can see that there is a complete change to clean fuels. And we have seen that in countries like Bolivia that has a very high levels of indigenous population that have a lot of cultural background and tradition that you could say think that they will be reluctant to change. But when given them the opportunity to cook with clean fuels and given them affordability LPG, they have switched completely to LPG. Then I think that the change is possible, transition is possible. It's just a question of the policies and to put in place the right policies and to consider women needs and women possibilities. Because once you give women the possibility to clean with clean fuels, it's not just their health, but their time that you are improving. We have done studies that shows that cooking with polluting fuels takes longer. That women they need to spend sometimes twice as much cooking than what they will need cooking with LPG or electricity. And if you can translate that into productivity, that the productivity time of women is spent cooking when they could be doing something else. And it's really something that we have to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Much,
that.
Karen. I have one. Sorry,
Go
I
ahead.
have one or two questions as well here. I want to find out, okay, using legal instruments to addressing indoor air pollution, how do we strengthen our laws? I was thinking, particularly when decisions relating to accommodation, vis-a-vis structures and the activities within our personal, apart from the of the cooking method we're talking about, because already there are some synergy between the environment and health sector, because we know that our actions and inactions relates, I mean, ends up in the health implications we've been talking about. So how do we bring up, how do we engage constructions, engineers? Because the built up environment has input in this. I looked at it from that perspective where, okay, the structure of a building, the VOCs from the paints, and all other salient things that comes with the construction of building, it's partly involved in indoor air pollution. How do we engage this sector? How do we bring them on board? But because it's been mostly about the health sector and the environment. But we need to go beyond this and start talking to construction engineers, builders. So will Ponima want to speak to that?
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a very pertinent issue, but easier said than done, simply because I think the buildings and the constructions are not, it's not an individual, it cannot be just an individual level decision. Sometimes it's the cost, it's the family level comfort in terms of household incomes, the kind of housing that you are able to afford. So I mean, if there's subsidized housing or something that the governments at national and subnational levels can make possible, I think there the issues of the ideal house with the ideal ventilation and those kind of issues can be addressed. But it's, I mean, let's be cognizant of the fact that a big part of the population is, at least in India, is the rural households, So what can we do to address that big chunk of our population who is the most vulnerable? I think it requires, I think the key word again is intersectoral coordination. It's about ministries of women and child development, maybe the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Health, all needing to come together to bring together a very comprehensive approach to this whole thing. I think it's a whole of system approach, or the other way around, health in all the policies that we are doing, whether it's urban affairs ministry or the housing or the urban development. I think it requires a very strategic lens. Yeah.
Yes, quite strategic. Thank you.
I would
Thank you very much. You want to say something?
I would like to add in because for the construction sector, so I think right now we are working with the construction sector and how we are pitching
Oh,
this
fine.
this air pollution problem with the construction people. So I think last year or the I think before that there was a ban on the construction activities in Delhi region, Delhi NCR region, because of the air pollution. So I think the construction activities was stopped for the 6 months, and because of that, lots of billions of loss happened to the construction industry. So with that aspect, what we did, we went to the construction industries in our as a part of a clean direction plan, and we talk to them and we develop a clean construction guideline with them only. It's not it's not only our effort or like a science effort, so with them also, because now they are realizing, because what is, because sometimes these easy sectors become the prime culprit of this air pollution and other problems. So because of that, they have to face ban and other things. So whenever I think we are pitching this type of problem, we can tell them like these are the problems you may face. So if you can work with us, there would be a possibility that you would not be able to get this similar kind of problem in your city or the other cities. So with that, I think now construction people in India, I think at least in like our area of work, they are coming to us and they are saying that we would like to work on this sector, and we would, and they are coming in this. So it's a positive step, I would say, for the construction industry.
That's good. That's very good to know. Thank you very much, Dr. Ajay. No one's life, like I will always say, should be limited by how and what they cook with. So the Clean Cooking Alliance engaging Commonwealth nations, particularly the developing ones with slim resources and technical know-how, is still a challenge. So we hope we'll cross that path. So if I don't know if you have more questions, David, from the chat box. Chat room.
I'm looking at the chat box. There's none here. I'm looking because someone said they had a question just now on the WhatsApp, but it didn't come through. But I do have one other question I'd like to pose. I think it's either Dr. Purnima or Dr. Ajay raised the matter of indoor quality guidelines. But listening to Dr. Ajay talk just now about the construction sector, how difficult is it to put forward indoor quality guidelines where you have this driving demand for new construction? Is it a matter that has to take into consideration all of the sectors, economic sectors, and does it have to take into consideration social factors as well? So, and that's for any three of the panels.
So I think because while developing a construction guideline, so we went through the all rules and regulation as well as the like construction guideline. And what we found that for like when especially for the indoor air quality, or even we can say the environmental aspects. So the right now in India we do not give that much weightage to this factor in the construction industry. So I think there is a need for the awareness as well as the monitoring and proper monitoring of the proper implementation. And people, I think, especially even the construction people, builders, they would like to come in this aspect. So people are not aware. So I think we need to popularize these types of things in a public domain. So and there is no proper guideline for the construction people. That's what we have to develop this construction guideline for them. So yeah, it's a kind of lack of awareness.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Would
So-
like to take closing remarks. Oh, okay.
Dr.
Dr.
Purnima,
Oh, no, I just wanted to add, that, the building and the construction sector is one domain. If we are talking about indoor air quality, we should not forget that it's a lot to do with awareness and behavior change at the household level. A big chunk of it is due to the combustion, the use and combustion of biomass. So I think it's a very individual household centric kind of intervention that will address this problem. Of course, it's the building and the ventilation and guidelines for all of those sectors, but I think it's a very individual and household centric approach that needs to happen to make this change. So yeah, that's my personal view maybe, but I think it's 50% of the population using unclean cooking fuels. I think policies
Thank
and
you.
programs need to be
Yes,
centered around that.
Okay.
yes, and I would like to add that let's not forget that for many, many people there is not another option. Then it's not just a question of saying you cannot use any more firewood or charcoal in your building, or just putting some regulations in place if you don't have anything to give them to as another
As
option.
alternative.
And particularly sometimes they don't even have access to, as was already pointed, that some people just don't have the access, don't have the electricity, don't have LPG, don't have any other source to cook. Then we have to consider all this together. And I think that, for example, in my opinion, the building sector is an opportunity maybe to consider in urban areas, like how we are going to provide different standard regulations that will make more possible for people, or more difficult maybe sometimes for people to cook with polluting fuels. I have seen, for example, in Honduras, people in urban cities sometimes they have to cook with cleaner fuels, not necessarily by choice, but because they are renting and their landlords don't allow them to cook, to burn firewood or charcoal inside their households. And in a way, is a different way of making changes. It's not as desirable, because what you would like is for people to make their choice themselves and to be convinced and to know that what is the right thing to do for their families, and that has a lot to say. Because I think that if the health sector were to join efforts and to really help make raise awareness regarding the health impacts and everything, I think that it will be, I mean, a combination of factors, because it's not always easy. Because just to think about it as a behavioral problem or behavioral change will imply that people is not making the right choices. But I just want to really highlight that sometimes to make the right choice is not a choice, and sometimes it's not something that you can really do. Then we have to consider all that into the equation. It is indeed a very complex issue.
Thank you very much, Karen. I want to thank everyone, Dr. Fonima, Dr. Ajay, for being for the enlightenment, really. Because for me, I was also going to say, after what the last speaker said, the need for indoor regulations, I mean, construction, talk about guidelines for construction firm. Having, because I don't know if it's very common in the rural area, even in the city center, some don't even have extractors, as little as that. If it's basic that every apartment must have extractors within, it kind of improves the air quality. So it's one of those little details that we can look at in setting up the guidelines. It's one of those we can put together. Thank you very much. So I want to appreciate everybody for making today a success, this indoor air pollution management. Thank you all for coming, and please stay on. Thank you, David.
BC, thank you. I wanted to add my personal thanks to Dr. Karen, Dr. Ajay, and Dr. Purnima as well, for what has been a very enriching panel again. I think indoor air pollution really hits home in a lot of ways. I mean, it's so tied to a lot of the cultural practices we have, and we go about these everyday ways of doing things without realizing the effect that certain traditional things that we do has on us. So, but yes, I really appreciated that. BC, I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for moderating the session for us. For those of you who don't know, and let me just go quickly here so I can introduce BC a bit more. BC is a member of our working group, and she, sorry, let me just pull this up while I'm grabbing it, lost it here. She works for La CEPA, which is the Lagos State Environmental Protection Agency in Nigeria. And she's been a part of the working group that has been instrumental in planning this event, and putting together all of the 4 webinars and the research papers we've had done, the policy brief. So BC, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you once again to the panelists. That brings to a close this is our 4th session for day 1. We now have a short break of about 15 minutes before the start of our session 5, which looks at greening technologies and industries as one way of approaching air pollution, of dealing with the matter of air pollution. So thank you very much, everyone. And to all of the attendees, take a break now, grab that coffee or that juice or water, a snack, and then come back and join us for the final session of today.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
4, 3, 2, 1. We go live.
Kia ora and welcome to session 5 of this conference. We will focus on promoting green and non-polluting industries. My name is Kate Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Island Partnership, and I'm based in New Zealand. But our partnership was founded by two presidents really to focus on mobilizing political leadership in islands to implement conservation and sustainability initiatives. We've been in existence for more than 10 years, and in the last couple of years, I think most relevant to what we're going to talk about today, we've been working on a new network focused on mobilizing early leadership on SDG implementation and climate change and resilience. We're about to make a big announcement on that in the next couple of months about its expansion, but that's really looking at how to support islands in implementing sustainable development goals, moving from kind of this high level discussion on it to what that looks like on the ground. Mostly what we're doing in that is supporting the development of green growth initiatives in a number of islands, both developing and developed. We work together with a partner organization in Hawaii called Hawaii Green Growth to really mobilize this initiative focused on the policy and process for implementing the SDGs. And I think it's particularly exciting. If you're interested in learning more, please go to our website for the local 2030 Islands Network. But in terms of this panel, which I think is really important and dealing with an issue that is often not discussed, particularly for someone like me working both in this green growth, sustainable development space and also for a really long time in islands, we don't see this air pollution issue in the island space discussed that much. And I think a lot of times for islands, people imagine this kind of lovely place, idyllic settings, places they're going to go on holiday with some type of magical island life. But the reality often includes the impacts of air pollution. Like many other places globally, this is often an issue which is often not prioritized or recognized for its potential impact. Of course, it's not as big a challenge as some of the largest cities in the world, and I know in this conference you'll have been talking about that. But in the small island states, the fragile economic and environmental conditions, limited technological and human capacity, issues around economies of scale, and a recognized high level of vulnerability can really make issues like poor air quality much worse. Well, what are some of the solutions to this? How can small states offer some of these? I've lived in a couple of Pacific Island countries, and the air quality was surprisingly poor in urban areas. This corresponds with the fact that for small island developing states in particular, particulate matter from vehicles is the largest source of air pollution due to crowded urban locations and really an increasing movement and migration into urban areas from outer islands and more rural areas, which is kind of increasing urbanization. In this panel, we'll talk about some of the incentive frameworks and policies that can support a shift to green, non-polluting industries and social habits that can really start to change this trajectory, and how these can intersect with a range of other considerations, including poverty, increased costs related to scale and distance from where technology or markets are found, and what some of the win-win policies might be, the connection between better air quality and climate change as well. Some of the solutions to the issue of air pollution can also include things that are addressing climate change, including shifting to low carbon mobility to reduce emissions of pollutants, or shifting to renewable energy like solar and wind to decrease oil consumption. Also potentially taxing cruise and airplane emissions and developing regulations towards air pollution. These are all important considerations as islands grapple with the potential of a green recovery and of building resilience. We will now hear from a very distinguished panel on what some of the options are for this transition to green, non-polluting industries. And I will introduce each as they speak. But we have, in more detail, we have, firstly, Dr. Kalim Shah, who is a recognized expert on public policy, regulation and governance in small island jurisdictions. And he's also the director of the Island Policy Lab and a professor of energy and environmental policy at the Joseph R. Biden Jr. School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Delaware. He's held faculty posts from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs in Indiana University and the University of Trinidad and Tobago, which is where he comes from. He was appointed as the coordinator of the university's consortium of small island states, a United Nations multi-stakeholder partnership, and served as the coordinating lead author for an environmental policy assessment of the UN Global Environment Outlook. Dr. Shah, you have the floor to have some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak. Just a word on the Island Policy Lab, which I direct at the Biden School. This is a new initiative for us, identifying sort of a strategic opportunity and a gap, really, in that there's a lot of scientific and technical research that has been surging in island contexts in recent years, driven by obviously things like concerns around climate impacts, but also things like resource responsibility in terms of blue economy, our oceans, and so on, and pollution. But we've also identified that much of this scientific information is not getting into the policy discourse in as much priority as we would like. So the Island Policy Lab is really meant to be the vehicle through which we can do that, to pull all of this wonderful scientific information and data that we have and funnel it through leading edge policy practices, policy modeling approaches, policy tools, different types of data intensive analyses, and really try to put that idea of science-based and evidence and data-driven policy into practice. And we are hoping to do this in conjunction with island governments and many of our island stakeholders. We have two streams of this work that is currently underway. One is with our US island territories, and the other is with the context that I'm most familiar with, the small island developing states. But with that being said, to today's conversation on greening industry and air pollution, I think there's the saying, there's three sides to every story, right? There's your side, there's my side, and then there's the truth, right? But in today's conversation, I want to sort of lay it out as there's three sides that we can look at greening technology, greening economies, and air pollution. One is on the producer side, one is the consumer side, and then the third one, which I'll focus on a little bit in the next 3 minutes, is the government side or the regulatory side. So, as a sort of a public policy person, I tend to look at a couple of things when we start to talk about how the regulatory environment is able to manage or deal with topics, issues like air pollution, as well as other types of pollution that we find in small states. One of the first things we have to consider is, are we setting the right kinds of targets? We need to have benchmarks and targets to move towards. And in between that spectrum, we need to have milestones. So one of the things that we observe in small island states might be, in some cases, not setting targets and milestones. So not really having that roadmap fully prepared. Another thing that we see might be an overzealousness of sometimes too ambitious targets without putting the necessary checks and balances and resources and processes in place. So target setting is something that I see as important for air pollution reduction and other types of pollution. The other piece is, so, we say sort of in policy, we say people, process, and resources, right? So the other piece is really about process. So do we have regulatory processes in place? Do we have regulatory processes, meaning legislation, command and control regulations, standards, industry guidelines? Do we have those kinds of mechanisms in place? And then the challenge for many small states in saying that then is command and control approaches are often very resource intensive. And therefore we fall short on the implementation, on the monitoring, assessment, evaluation, being able to get the results from the investment and those kinds of formal approaches. Then we have market-based approaches, which are more industry and business and industry relevant. And it's all about carrots and sticks. Are we designing market-based instruments with the right mix for our small state contexts, right? This is another thing, sort of the heterogeneity of many of different small states, right? Are we designing our carrots and sticks in ways that do not hamper economic development, but make economic development sustainable? So this is another piece of the puzzle I would suggest. Then thirdly, the institutions, the institutional framework that we have to work with, both sort of the formal institutional framework of the organizations and the operations to manage pollution in small states, as well as sort of the more, what I would call the softer institutions that have to do with the ways that we do things, cultural and behavioral considerations as well. And lastly, sort of on this regulatory side of how we deal with things is resources. Do we have the necessary resources, physical resources, but also human resources? Many times we may develop policies, plans, strategies, but we may lack that human resource, and we are dependent on others for technical assistance, and the circle goes on and on and on without building the necessary local capacity in our small states to deal with issues of air pollution and pollution regulation. So I will stop there just to say the other two sides, the producer side, right? On the producer side, there are things that producers, business and industry operating in small states need to consider. Life cycle assessment, extended producer responsibility, things like that. And then on the consumer side, we have to consider sort of on a broader scale, local consumption behavior patterns. Electricity, energy is very expensive in many small island states. What is our consumer behavior like? What are our consumer patterns and trends going to be like moving forward through 2030, 2040, 2050? And how we can accommodate those on the regulatory side, right? But also on a broader scale, we have to consider in a development context, Do our small states continue to be resource intensive and hence pollution intensive, increasing externalities of pollution, to feed the conveyor belt of satisfying the industrialized world with exports, right? Are we to continue to be commodity type states? Are we to continue to be dependent on even in the service sector, the tourism, sun, sea, sand tourism, for example, the mass tourism models? Are we to continue to have that dependency? Because these or are we going to shift into cleaner, greener, more value-added, less resource-intensive types of operations that have lower pollution externalities? And these are some broader issues that we can consider in the discussion. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. That was awesome. And I think your issues around the building of local capacity and whatever approach is taken is really important in a small states context, particularly looking at capacity kind of at both the national level and also the regional level. What is the capacity within regions to support these transitions? And then also the importance of making economic development sustainable. This is a kind of a really key point I take away, and that it needs to fit what small states need. Whatever solutions come need to be suited to this place, which may seem perfectly obvious, but quite often is not the case in how things and solutions are developed. We're going to move now to our next speaker. And we'll have some opportunity after the panel to ask some questions of all the panelists. So please have your questions ready and put them in the chat. Our next speaker is Stefano Monkana, who has a PhD in economics and lectures and conducts research in the areas of development, poverty, climate change, islands, and small state studies. He previously worked in the Italian Parliament as a policy analyst, but he now joins us as the director of the Islands and Small States Institute, lecturer and researcher with the Institute for European Studies of the University of Malta, and he's part of the executive committee of the European Association of Development and Training Institutes of the Mediterranean Experts on Climate Change and Environmental Change, and acts as an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, Dr. Monkana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much for this introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers and the Ramphal Institute and, of course, Kate for chairing this meeting and our distinguished colleagues here in the panel today, and all the participants. So thank you for joining. The Islands and Small State Institute, which is the institute where I come from, with the University of Malta, promotes teaching, research, and training in many aspects of islands and small states. And we're proud of offering, as far as we know, the only doctorate in islands and small state studies. In the course of the past 30 years, the Institute has had an important impact on the small island state literature, but also on public policy, especially on important points like focusing on the vulnerability, the resilience, the resourcefulness of many islands, and more recently also on issues related to climate change and public health, which I'll touch upon later on as well. This has also been possible through the importance of cooperation with many research centers also located in islands. So the strength that we have managed to put together also comes from this understanding that the context and the issues that relate to islands and small states can be very much tackled well if there is this form of cooperation. Many of these partners are here today also in this panel, so very happy to see this cooperation continuing. Now, more to the points of the conference and those that Kate also highlighted at the beginning, and building also on the excellent points from Kalim. We do know that many islands face vulnerabilities due to small size and remoteness. Now, this limits economies of scale and increases the cost of practically everything from transportation to production. Now, using, for example, highly polluting sources of fuel to produce energy, and which are usually the cheapest, sometimes the only available, is the only option for islands, which also find accessing greener renewable energy, low carbon technologies, such as photovoltaics or wind energy, at a higher cost, and sometimes with more difficulties than larger states or mainlands. Now, notwithstanding these vulnerabilities and this problem, these issues, many islands have managed to build strong, resilient economies and societies, and started to switch towards green energy production. I'll mention some very good examples that I'm sure resonate with all of you. Now, this is due to, we believe, this is due to a mix of resourcefulness of islanders and societies, which through the course of the years, they've managed to adapt and to be very innovative, but also to an appropriate set of policy measures that authorities have put into place and adopted to support building resilience, along the lines of the points highlighted by Kalim. Now, however, this is the main point I would like to make here, is that this resilience building and the fighting of sources of pollution and the switch towards low carbon technologies comes at a very high cost. Per capita costs in islands are higher than any other larger state. So building resilience and fighting sources of pollution and doing the right thing for many islands costs more. So putting islands at a disadvantage as a starting point. Now, as I said before, this did not preclude islands from succeeding or tackling the issues as they should be, and sometimes even being even more innovative in the way solutions are tackled and sometimes also found. However, another point I would like to make here is that this aspect is not sufficiently accounted for. The fact that islands have, or let's say that on average, their ranking is pretty good in many areas, in many performances, it comes at a very high cost, and this is not sufficiently accounted for. And I believe, for example, that should be a strong argument to consider resilience building with all this cost associated to it, more than vulnerability, as a factor, for example, to access concessional rates and funds, especially for SIDS. And this would come very handy when you need to find some resources, for example, to switch towards different sources of energy and better technology, which are usually, at a higher cost, at least for the time being. Which links me to another point, hopefully the last one before I pass on the baton to my colleagues. We must consider that existing development deficits when tackling air pollution in general climate change, I would say, should come on top and above the need to attain sustainable development. We cannot always have a zero-sum game or a situation where combating air pollution and climate change should come at the expense of existing problems. So, for example, we already know that this very regressive, these issues, right? So there are elements of poverty, of gender-based differences. Now, every year we have almost $5 trillion, almost 7% of the total GDP of the world. Okay, although I don't like too much using measurements of GDP, however, this is just to give us an idea. It goes to, all this amount of 5 trillion goes to subsidize fossil fuels. Now, I am sure that there is a set of resources which could be used or switched and used better for the transition to this low carbon economy or neutral carbon neutral society that could go faster and help, especially islands which have a higher cost for this transition, as a possible good practice. I will leave some of the good examples coming from SIDS and other islands for perhaps later on, or other parts where we can have a dialogue with other panelists and people coming from the participants. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefano. That was wonderful. And I think it's really important as we talk about transitions that we talk about the cost and the real cost proportionate to the amount of people in these islands and some of the ways that they might actually deal with it. I think we also, in our partnership and all the work we do, really recognize how resourceful islanders are and how many solutions they have found and are sharing and undertaking, but this cost issue is a real one, and the ability to access finance as well. And I think your last point really about the need to also address not to kind of move into one space and leave the sustainable development space behind. I think the Sustainable Development Goals themselves offer a real solution for that, and the idea of kind of looking at things together rather than always in separate silos. And I think that this issue of air pollution really lends itself well to that space. So thank you very much. We're going to move now to our next speaker, who is Janelle Green de Wasmes, who has worked in the Caribbean as a trade development consultant and a monitoring and evaluation specialist for the past 8.5 years, with expanding focus on the African, Pacific, and other developing country regions. She is currently a PhD candidate at the Environment, Geography, and Politics Department at the University of York in the United Kingdom. Based out of the Stockholm Environment Institute, her research work focuses on green energy transitions in small island developing states. Both her ongoing research and professional work include the overall areas of sustainable development, trade facilitation, and climate change. Janelle, you have the floor.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. So I'll be speaking mainly from my experience in policy implementation, and particularly in the Caribbean SIDS and my recent PhD findings. And going back to what my colleagues would have mentioned and alluded to in terms of this nexus between climate change and sustainable development. We know that studies suggest that transition towards a green economy, environmental reform holds strong potential for sustainable development benefits of long-term goals such as growth, job creation, and overall eradication of poverty or contribution towards that. However, there's limited empirical evidence research that from a policy design and implementation perspective help us to understand how does this occur, what approaches have countries been adopting, specifically what approaches adopted across SIDS and within SIDS, and what are the actual drivers, barriers, and influential context conditions that actually impact the outcomes that we observe to date. So SIDS themselves highlight within their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, that their climate change commitments are interconnected to their sustainable development needs. So for example, Jamaica's initial goal of 20% renewable energy share in the energy mix by 2030 is directly tied to their efforts to achieve SDG 7, access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Similarly, Antigua and Barbuda's NDC, which aims for 100% off-grid renewable energy electricity in the water sector, seeks to tie together this achievement of climate change commitments with social water demands, as well as the goal for other essential services and reliability in those services linked to energy supply. So we see that at least in up to 23 SIDS, a similar trend of mentioning specifically the link between sustainable development objectives, linked to the national context and needs, and renewable energy or sustainable energy practices. So my synthesized findings from my case studies, which look at Jamaica, Barbados, and Mauritius, provide some interesting findings on what the main factors are that actually have impacted their green energy transition outcomes that we can observe, looking specifically at the 2000 to 2018 period. The main two factors that were most impacting their outcomes were found to be national capacities, which my colleagues would have mentioned, specifically real debt and the availability of donor and domestic financing resources came up, Second would have been effective resource allocation. Specifically, how have corruption levels, especially in public admin, affected the ability to achieve green energy transition outcomes and ambitions? Three other main factors were also important in terms of affecting the uptake of renewable energy technologies, but to a lesser extent. And these were national and external market conditions, for one, specifically whether or not transition roadmap was present at the national level, changes in global oil prices and utility ownership status, which was interesting. Climate governance was another issue, specifically the extent to which stakeholders are able to participate or allowed to participate within the renewable energy sector. Example via feed-in tariff, independent power producer policy, civil society participation. And lastly, SID's developing country landscape itself. Especially came up was the historical context linked to colonization and the colonial past and the plantation economy. Other issues that also arose was environmental preconditions linked to water scarcity, for example, which I would have touched on with the examples of Jamaica and Antigua and Barbuda, for example. It's important to note that over this timeline, any of these 5 thematic areas and the factors that fall under could have impacted renewable energy uptake positively and negatively. So it really depended at the point in time. So the implications for that in terms of a policy making and design process is the need for reflexive policy, a reflexive policy process, ongoing reform, constant monitoring to see what are the conditions on the ground and how do we keep making sure that we're adapting, because one day a factor could be positive, another day can be more negative than positive. So how do we keep up to date? Some main policy insights that stood out from across the 3 countries' experiences, and this is from speaking to local stakeholders within the renewable energy sector. An important one that came up was donor financing. While it could positively impact green energy transition, where it outweighed internal capacity available, this had a negative impact on green energy transition because countries had less control over their green energy transition experiences. So that's interesting in that having sufficient national capacity in the form of human and financial resources plays a crucial role then in achieving the green energy transition outcomes that we observe across these countries. Government was another important aspect in terms of being an actor in steering conducive conditions for green energy transition. But also important was a minimum level of wider participation, which is needed for success. Specifically, stakeholder participation that at minimum includes an attractive feed-in tariff, and attractive being a key word there, interconnection standards, and either net metering or billing or independent power producers permitted. And I'll end on this last point in terms of policy insights that arose and that links to the transition context conditions. Results indicated that generally the combined certain combination of conditions were most conducive to renewable energy uptake across the 3 islands looked at. And these were at least partially participatory actor landscape. So what that means, at least an attractive feed-in tariff, interconnection standards in place, either net metering or billing or independent power producers were permitted, lower corruption levels, a majority private-owned utility versus a public-owned utility. And interestingly enough, and contrary to existing literature and the global approach or a paradigm for implementing green energy transition policy, is the absence of a renewable energy roadmap had a more positive impact on the uptake of renewable energy technologies than where it was present. So where it was present, it had an overall negative impact on uptake. So this implies that perhaps bottom-up approaches versus top-down approaches may be more suitable for these smaller island contexts. So I'll leave it there for now, and we can continue. I'll hand it back to you now, Kate, for any questions that may come up.
Thank you, Janelle. I think we really benefited from the fact you've just been doing research on this really important issue, and you have actual case studies. It's really interesting, this issue of the renewable energy roadmap and how there's different perspectives. I think what I really took from that is the importance of a participatory process in this transition and in policies and implementation. Again, the issue around capacity, local capacity, to do some of these things. And I think that that there's kind of the same issues that are in all of the things we see, particularly in small island states, around the debt issues and access to financing to make these types of transitions, which we hopefully these issues are being dealt with as we speak, I hope. We're going to move now into questions, and I will ask the audience to share questions in the chat, and then we will see them. But in the meantime, I think I'm going to ask some questions that we have here. What I'm going to ask you, Carlin, what do you think in terms of the green transition that is taking place are some of the best examples of this that we could learn from? Like, where are some good examples of green transition from your experience?
Sure. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, and from the Caribbean experience, I think we have some good sector level examples. But if I may, I just wanted to address one or two points from the other speakers as well.
Yep.
From one of the things that struck me as important from Stefano's discussion was this idea of the starting point of islands, because most of our developing islands are heavily indebted to start with, and that affects how much government is willing to attract external investors. So there's one piece of cultivating local investors, but there's also the other side of attracting foreign direct investment, especially in areas such as clean energy, right? And I think that really affects us. And this is sort of the broader issue, I think, also that Stefano is indirectly talking about, especially in terms of when we started to talk about the climate justice kind of approach, where the opportunities for climate finance, they may not always be equitable from the point of view of islands because of the handicap of the starting point that we're at, heavy indebtedness. So I just wanted to fully agree with that point that was made. And then with Janelle, I also find that the roadmap issue is really interesting because, and as I was mentioning in my points, that target setting is really something very important. The lack of or the inability to the targets, the roadmap, the milestones, and having that kind of strategy laid out. When we see, perhaps as you found in your research, that there may be some kind of inverse relationship or relationship that is counterintuitive, I would ask, or I would interpret some of that perhaps as the disconnect between a national target setting approach and what might really be needed, as you say, from that bottom-up approach. If the targets that are set, the roadmap that is developed, is less consequential to the reality on the ground, then stakeholders are going to move in directions that they find consequential, and it may not parallel what the national roadmap might necessarily say. So I would want to find out. I'm very curious about that particular finding. In terms of best case, best policy scenarios, I believe Barbados is an excellent example on the green energy front. They have been leaders on green technologies in terms of energy efficient water heaters, for example, is often cited as an excellent case. I do feel that we have some traction in the tourism sector in some places, in some of the larger hotel chains. in the Bahamas, for example. There's some examples in Jamaica and a couple other places. But that is a combination of sort of the green and clean kind of approach to tourism, is jointly sort of it's a relationship between industry and, as I was saying, government regulations, right? And sort of the voluntary approaches that are implemented by some in the hotel and hospitality and tourism sector. So I do think that there's some good examples.
Well, I do too. So thank you. I think Janelle will get you to answer some points that Callum said in a minute. But Stefano, how significant is it having the right regulatory framework for green economy progress, kind of this bigger green shift that we're seeing?
Of course, it's essential. Kalim has already pointed some of the key issues that are at stake here. I think that the capacity of islands to be performing relatively well, notwithstanding these initial vulnerabilities that there are, points towards a good level of governance in general. And when this level of governance meant has a response from the local authorities, from national governments, to do something about those initial vulnerabilities, being this a regulatory framework that opens up the market, that regulates better, that gives access to important resources, that facilitates the also operators in the market to act usually fairly and to have access to those important resources. That's crucial. So I think that having something that works and that is made available as a framework that increases that has good level of governance, increases resilience, and helps the countries to advance and to be ready to also face new threats, as we're seeing with climate change. Now, I believe also that many seas and islands are in general, in many places, leading the way in operations to adopt sustainable energy generation as well. Now, it is in general, I think even the international community and some investors have understood this, that in islands is in general, of course, easier to operate in a way. It is faster to find authorities that respond promptly. The social capital, the resourcefulness of people can facilitate even the life cycles of projects. And sometimes, as we know, unfortunately, these important projects have a short lifespan. And in islands, because of these characteristics, it might be easier to operationalize them and to make them happen. And of course, international authorities and investors want to see a project coming to an end in the shortest time possible. So islands, as usual, we have this thing that they say that they are laboratories, right? Now, I think that we are moving away, even at higher levels than being laboratories. I think many cases we finished being tested, and there is this level of now recognizing that things can be done also in many resourceful manners. For example, from Orkney in Scotland, Fiji, the Seychelles, Barbados, as was mentioned, Jamaica, these are all islands, in most of the cases seas, that are launching ambitious programs to revolutionize their economies and through renewable energies, many with goals of reaching 100% in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. Now, the main point I want to make here is that supporting these schemes is essential. And as I said before, this comes at a higher cost for many islands. Now, they are already highly in debt, they have a high debt. I would add myself, sometimes this debt is unfairly high. I don't want to enter into the mechanisms, because we open a Pandora box here, but, I am sure there are ways in which this concession rates or access to finance internationally could be revisited, given these initial vulnerabilities and the higher cost of islands to operate. So, especially when we are in a crisis, both for air quality as well as adapting fast to climate change, I am sure that some of these mechanisms should be revisited. And the investments in green energy perhaps could be offset against the debt, especially that many islands have. Why not? So we have to think a bit creatively about this. And given the sometimes scarce resources we have in front of us, this could be one of the solutions.
And there are definitely some areas where debt swaps for climate action are happening in some islands, like the Seychelles, for example, which is thinking very innovatively about some of these different approaches. I think touching on both of the points you made, that the issue is about debt, but it's also about the project pipeline. It's about investment, people perceiving islands to be quite high risk and small in scale. So it's looking at some of the solutions to that, I think, are really important. Janelle, what are some of the, following your really great intervention earlier, what are some of the factors that you've identified as most impacting SID's ability to meet their emissions commitments via green energy technologies? And what do you think are the most important takeaways for small states to consider towards the successful planning and implementing of their sustainable energy ambitions?
Well, let me first tack back to Callum's question / comment quickly. And relate to roadmaps and the effectiveness of roadmaps and their impact on green energy tech uptake. For example, looking at Barbados, while there has been much public-private dialogue in terms of forming the policies that and strategies and roadmap that has been developed, and I find this has been an issue in terms of policy implementation across the Caribbean, not just in climate change, but across policies in general. There seems to be a deficit between drafting really great documents and implementing them effectively. And this is linked to several issues. And one of which is access to financing from the key actors who are actually the ones who stimulate change or drive the change. Private sector, for example. Through my interviews, a lot of the stakeholders complained that their inability to invest in large-scale renewable energy uptake is linked to a lack of public-private partnerships. Since the public sector gets the bulk of green financing, it goes to public sector institutions. It's not usually that a private company that wants to, for example, transition out their operations to be more green can directly apply for financing. It's usually through the government receives the funds, whether it's through the IDB or GIZ, and only if they choose or in the design, it is in a way that they facilitate PPPs. Then the actual persons who are actually driving the change will have easy, non-bureaucratic, that takes 3-4 years to access the funds, access to this. So I think that's a huge impediment, and probably one of the reasons why having probably some of these formal structures create bottlenecks that we didn't really think of in the first place. So that would be one of my main responses to that question. Another interesting one was in Mauritius, in terms of the linkages to historical context in the plantation economy, and some of the stuffs that were brought forward in terms of who owns the assets that are used to transition into renewable energy, which started in the sugarcane production sector, which to this day still remain with the plantocracy, French Creole class, and a mischance for democracy within that sector because of the way in which policies were designed. So I think sometimes I think those issues link towards the data results in terms of the effect that a roadmap currently is not the most effective, and perhaps trying to facilitate how do we get these people who are, or the actors who are actually driving large scale change, to be more directly linked to the resources or the ability to make a change within the landscape. And going back to your other question, I think because SID's developing country characteristics, lack of capacity, tackling issues such as corruption and the distribution of resources, which ties back to what I was just speaking of as well. I think because those issues are the main ones that distinguish their experience of transition versus larger developing countries even and developed countries, it's really important that to ensure success, appropriate policies or strategies that are relevant to the national conditions and national capacity gaps are deployed alongside green energy transition measures. And you would have spoken about this as well in terms of not doing things in silos. But from the very get-go thinking, if I want to increase renewable energy in the private sector, what do I know of the bottlenecks the private sector faces in general in getting access to financing, even getting a loan, a traditional loan, far less a loan for green energy technologies? What simultaneous policies in terms of sustainable development should I deploy alongside those climate strategies? So just simultaneous or harmonized planning in terms of the policy process. And these supplementary strategies should help to overcome specific barriers faced. They should be targeted because of the lack of resources. They should leverage available capacities and opportunities. And this doesn't just have to be internal, it could be external. And this tacks back to a previous question as well, that you were asking about examples to Callum. And that makes me think of Jamaica in terms of, I think it was the solar PV sector, where they did a blended financing approach to finance the introduction of solar farms, large scale, utility scale solar farms. They did equity, loans, grants, foreign collaborations. They had an arrangement under Petrocaribe that contributed towards the solar farm. So it was really interesting how, despite their limitations, they found a creative cocktail of financial options to still drive their ambitions.
Well, I like the use of a creative cocktail. I think we might try and adopt that as a terminology we could use in things. I actually wanted to kind of touch, and it's a question for everyone, on the issue of technology in this transition. As a person who works on islands, I'm probably approached constantly from people wanting to give islands technology, sell islands technology, help in some ways. What are some of the ways that you've kind of seen that islands are filtering or identifying what is going to actually work in our context and in our island? Kaleem, I'll start with you, particularly from a technological perspective, but also from some of these kind of complex deals that are undertaken to support this moving forward. There's a lot of sharks out there who are pushing their kind of ideas about how this transition will take place. How do islands deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Kate. So we just at our lab we just ran some workshops, online virtual workshops with lots of island experts on the same topic of technology adoption policy and island sustainability. And some of the interesting points that come out is number one, should islands actually be involved in technology development, right? If you look at the investments that are required for first breakthroughs and second breakthroughs in significant technologies, you're looking at economies that typically invest 3 to 5% of GDP in R&D. And this is not a situation that small island developing states find themselves in. But what we should be looking at perhaps is not technology development, but technology adaptation. So looking at best practice technologies in other circumstances and investing in piloting or leapfrogging from those types of technologies to tailor them for our specific island contexts. And we have some examples of that in water resource management, for example. We have some ideas emerging on that in terms of low emissions vehicular technologies in some places. So there's opportunity like that on the technology front. Now, that is not to say that we should exclude indigenous technology development, but to fast pace, to generate the results on technologies that we need to in the time frames that we need to, which is like as of yesterday, right? We need to be partnering with those who are further up on that S-curve, as we say, right? That technology development S-curve. So partnerships are very important in this regard. I've just spoken to some folks who are looking at wind technology in the Bahamas, and the Denmark Technological University, DTU, which who are leaders in that kind of technology, and looking at tailoring some of that wind farm technology in places like the Bahamas. So, similar things are happening in Fiji as well. And Kate, you may know of that emphasis in Fiji's updated energy strategy. So partnerships on technology is also very important. An interesting point that Janelle also brings up is who owns what, right? Who owns assets? And this also came up in our discussions in terms of intellectual property and patents, right? So even so, there's some, and this came up in the context of smart agriculture and climate smart agriculture in some of the islands, and particularly also in the Jamaican context of the cannabis, right? So this is also something we have. Many of our islands don't have the legislative securities, let's say, to protect our intellectual property, and this can be a stumbling block for indigenous entrepreneurs, let's say, in an indigenous business to actually take part in that sort of innovation of technology process. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Stefano, do you want to talk to this issue, or yeah, Stefan?
Just very quickly, because there are so many good points that that Kalim and Janelle have raised, and so very quickly on this, that I think this is a very key issue, that if and when islands, especially island states, I would say, because for communities maybe a bit more treacherous, come together, it is much easier to tackle the issues that we see in other areas. For example, when you have these economies of scale, or you cannot reach a market. So teaming up is very important, and I think it has worked already to this end, and to the advantage of many islands who could not, for example, who had higher costs, for example, when purchasing medicines. So they come together, they stock, and they ask, and of course they buy in bulk together, and therefore the prices goes down.
I think we've just lost him. Maybe we'll shift to you now on that same question around technology, and we can come back to Stefano if he is able to rejoin.
I think based on my research and based on interviews conducted on the ground and just working in policy implementation within island settings, I think the technologies chosen should be really driven by national infrastructure needs and environmental preconditions, not solely, but I think these are two of the main things that really came up. So for example, grid upgrades and the need for smart grids. A lot of these electricity grids, for example, in islands are outdated, old, inefficient. So before you even think about introducing renewable energy technology, the cost to upgrade those systems, which many times the utility is not really incentivized to do on their own. Sometimes the government has to subsidize it. If it's a national government, then it's less complicated. But these are issues that need to be considered within island settings where the grid is usually a monopoly, and most persons are connected to the grid for their energy needs, electricity energy needs, depending on the island. Well, particularly in the Caribbean anyway. Water scarcity, for example, in Jamaica was an issue. So hydro wasn't as considered an option compared to Suriname or Guyana. because just for the basic needs of providing social water to persons. And there are similar issues in terms of biogas and biomass that it wasn't able to scale up because there was missing legislation, missing policies for pricing and reward systems needed and linked to waste management that is needed to expand and develop that sector. So all of these things are issues that need to be looked at, and then okay, you decide these are the conditions and what technologies make sense within this context, within these national infrastructural and environmental and even social conditions that make sense, given all the intricacies of development needs as well. So I think that's how the choices or should be guided.
Awesome, thank you. And we have one final question, I think, that we'll ask you, Janelle, because or anyone actually can answer this, and then we'll move to some closing remarks from each of you. So we have a question from Belize, and the project is about a project speaking to the large issue of the Sustainable Development Goals, in that it would advance the elimination of poverty, contribute to education and better health for Belizean children. But we have someone asking for some insights on how an entity such as the one that they are setting up this year in southern Belize, which will be a all green energy renewal project or production facility, garner some contributory expertise, funding and business advice, and also possible directives on how to approach and deal with the Belizean government and their policies in terms of natural gas production. So you could touch on really how they would get support. Is there anyone that would like to talk to that?
Well, I know from my experience in proposal writing and helping to design projects, unfortunately, this is just the way it is when accessing funds. You don't necessarily write the proposal from what you need, but from how your needs ticks the boxes of the available funds that most realistically you can access. At least that's been my experience so far and continues to be my experience with accessing development funds across different areas. So I would say, first look at how your project or the goals that you want to achieve align with a suitable donor that's as close to what you want to achieve, and then align or redesign your project that you can still achieve what you want, but also ticks those boxes so that you're most likely to be successful in accessing those funds, whether it be technical or financial, and partnering with strategic partners. I can't emphasize enough how that's really important as well. It's okay to know where you lack the ability or the expertise to achieve something. Strategic alliance with somebody else can help you to really focus on what's your strength, and they can focus on what's good for them, and it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So searching out strategic alliances with entities, whether it be public, private, even say a corporate social responsibility department might decide they want to help a community, and perhaps somewhere along your project, maybe not the whole thing, but aspects could be funded out of it because it aligns at least with that company's goal. So being really dynamic, open your mind. It doesn't have to all be funded from one entity. It could be various entities. So being a little strategic and innovative in how you access and look for funding. And I would say this similar for government. In the islands, it's always useful to have someone when you don't. I think I would go back to the same approach of trying to see how at best you can tick the boxes of what their goals are, their mandates are, and then go from there. So it's kind of working backwards, but that's just the way it is.
That's really helpful and clear. Thanks, Janelle. And I will now ask each of you, starting with Kaleem, to give us some of your closing thoughts for about 2 minutes and kind of what things you would advise moving forward.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. So I want to stick to sort of the policy discourse a little bit, and we mentioned one of the words flexible policy, because we are in a very dynamic kind of environment these days where green technology is advancing. We're talking about technology adoption or adaptation. We are learning more and more about the impacts of climate change on our islands and understanding those more. So the rate of scientific understanding of these phenomena is fast, right? And a lot of things are also happening on a global scale in terms of the international structures for environmental protection, for climate change, climate financing, and so on. So we are actually living in a very exciting time, right? Where there's a lot of dynamism in this green technology and green economy development space, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. So policy has to be extremely as Janelle had mentioned, reflexive. But and indeed, I've seen this in terms of gaining private sector, building private sector alliances, where oftentimes the private sector suggests that government is moving too slow for us. They're too bureaucratic for us. It takes too long. We're actually on go, and they're still on maybe, right? So reflect flexible policy, but at the same time, policy cannot be so flexible as to reduce the confidence of investors, and especially the private sector that we depend on. And this is what we're talking about in terms of green industry, right? The private sector needs a level of confidence that the playing field is fair, but it's also stable. Stability in the policy and regulatory playing field means that there's more confidence in investing in doing things in new and innovative ways, right? There's less risk involved. So I would say, as we look at policy frameworks, we try to understand how the industry that we're asking to make these changes views investments, and work hand in hand with incentive types of approaches to make the transition something that is equitable and fair. We always say, like, people, planet, and profits when we talk about corporate sustainability, right? I think that's still a good sort of maxim for us to have, even if we're on the regulatory side of things. Thank you.
Thanks, Callum. I think you've got a lot of things with 3 Ps, so you could probably hated that. Stefano?
Apologies for before, but I'm sure now we all got used to being cut every now and then, and so it's part of the game. I wanted to keep up the average, okay, of being cut from a conversation, so we should be okay now. Now, some final points. So I think that many actors who are involved in Alan's research and policy, including those who have intervened today, are already doing their part, and things are moving, as also Kalim and Janelle and you, Kate, have pointed out. But I'm sure, of course, that much more can be done. For example, donors, in my opinion, should consider creating a stream or a category of funds that give priority to Alan's research. Now, we often find, especially as researchers or people who are involved in organizations, different organizations, to do research in islands, that it's very difficult to sometimes tick those boxes that Janelle was mentioning, to conform to some funding available in order to support the work of local communities and governments and regional organizations to provide information valuable for policy to be informed by actual research. So that could be one of them. Now, I'd say that probably the dream of any researcher would be to see their own research being applied and help to inform policy. So, I think it would be a very good incentive for this to happen at all time. Another important point, which I've made many times probably already, in my previous interventions, is that we should try to shift away from subsidies that fund fossil fuels to go for, to use those subsidies for zero carbon economy. We already have the highest amount of subsidies nowadays in the world that are used for the wrong reason. And when I say wrong, I don't want to only pass a judgment, but we should really use this as an opportunity, okay, to redirect the current resources, because there are, but they are used in many instances in the wrong way. And finally, this concept of island laboratories, I think that's still very valid, but we should also try to move away from only thinking that islands as just, this labs and interesting, exciting things in the middle of something, but they are sometimes even more linked to mainlands because of their exposure and the necessity to be linked to mainlands than other large countries. So, this should be, I think, now hopefully be accounted for by also the international community. I think we're moving there, but hopefully we'll go there a bit faster in the next period. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you for those remarks. Wonderful. And Janelle.
Thanks. I think building on what my two colleagues said, I think there's a special need for just more empirical research within SIDS and across SIDS, and understanding how the experience is different from other countries, and then how in turn we can more empirically with data support the policy design and implementation process so it's more effective, it's more successful. Specifically looking at national capacity, resource allocation, national and external market conditions, the actor landscape, historical context, which for many SIDS were once colonies, when once colonized. How has that transition into their green energy and climate change adaptation mitigation experience? And overall increased use of statistical approaches, quantitative approaches to quantify that and to understand what is most important, what is also important, but to a lesser extent or only within this context. Also important in terms of going back to capacity and the ability of a country to have at least control of effectively steering their experience, even though they're accessing external resources or they're relying on external resources. The ability to better access finances to a wider stakeholder group that is not just the government, which mostly these types of finances are available to the government. So how can we expand that availability to private sector while also being, of course, having oversight and proper management of the funds, but also including a wider stakeholder groups, corporations, civil society corporations, private sector who want to get involved. How do we better enable those persons to access funds and not just have this bottleneck that all goes to government, who has limited capacity, limited staff, limited time to funnel out these resources then in turn to other stakeholders. So I think that's where I'd stop off.
Oh, thank you. Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think that was a wonderful wrap up of a really interesting session. I took a lot away from that. We're almost at time, but I just wanted to say, I think many of the issues that have been brought up are kind of similar across other issues when we're dealing with small states and small islands around local capacity, the tech space, interconnectivity between issues, and that islands working together connect and trying to group together actually can help with some of this response. These issues around data and finance are common across all of the issues, and I hope in our next session like this that we're looking at some of the solutions to some of these barriers and some of the opportunities that all these panelists have very articulately identified. So thank you very much to the organizers and to the panel for a really wonderful session. And I'm going to pass to David, who is going to finish.
Thank you so very much for a very, very rich panel. Again, I thought I was going to have a chance to write notes, but I figured let me just listen to what everybody is saying, because I don't want to lose the opportunity of catching it, and I'll have to go back to the videos now to capture some of the main points from these presentations. We do have a lot of rich material to work with going forward, particularly as it relates to small states. And Janelle, I think we probably need to rope you into our little group that we're working with here. I'm trying to put ideas together to see how the Ramphal Institute can, with the partners we have on the panel here, advance a new work program for small states in the Commonwealth. So that would be interesting. Well,
My
in the
pleasure.
Commonwealth, I think we really should look at including states that are not in the Commonwealth and outside as well. But thank you all very much for a very rich final panel for today. I want to remind everyone that we have day 2 tomorrow. We have 5 other sessions tomorrow. We start at 9 a.m. again. And hopefully we will have ironed out any of the little technical bugs that we had today. And we close tomorrow with 2 addresses by Anote Tong from Kiribati. He will be giving a closing address, as well as Aliza Ayaz, who was recently appointed UN Youth Envoy for Sustainable Development Goal 13. So, but we do have some very rich sessions tomorrow, including investment and financing for air pollution related work. So, kind of drawing on the broader context of financing, climate financing, and to understand why greater financing has not been earmarked for air pollution, and how Commonwealth countries could probably address that. So, Kate, Stefano, Dr. Kalim, Janelle, thank you all so very much. Nice seeing you guys again. Do have a good evening or a good day for the rest of the day, Kate. And hopefully I see you all online tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You.
Thanks. Bye-bye.